So let's talk about the road to World War II. We're going to break down step by calculated step how Nazi Germany's foreign policy in the 1930s completely unraveled the peace in Europe and pushed the continent into its most devastating war ever. It all ends here, September 1st, 1939. German tanks are rolling across the border into Poland. This is the moment that lights the fuse on a global war. But this wasn't some sudden explosion. It was the final, unavoidable spark after years and years of pressure building up. And that really is the big question, isn't it? How did this happen? How did a continent still covered in scars from the First World War find itself staring down the barrel of an even bigger catastrophe? Well, the answers are in a series of calculated gambles, big-time bluffs, and some really tragic failures of diplomacy. All right, here's how we're going to trace that path. It's really like a series of dominoes. We'll start with that post-war powder keg, watch as Hitler starts to test the limits, see how the policy of appeasement completely backfired, and then follow the final deceptive moves that made war pretty much inevitable. So first up, the post-war powder keg. You see, to really understand Hitler's rise, you have to understand the Germany he came from, a nation that felt deeply humiliated and angry about how the First World War ended. The peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, it wasn't a negotiation. The Germans called it a Diktat, a dictated peace. They were forced to take all the blame for the war, pay these massive, crippling reparations, and basically dismantle their military. This created a huge well of resentment across the entire country, which was just fertile ground for anyone promising to restore Germany's pride. And Hitler? Well, he had a very clear plan. Think of it as his personal to-do list for the 1930s. He wanted to tear up the Versailles Treaty, unite all ethnic Germans into one great nation, conquer Lebensraum, or living space in Eastern Europe, and of course, rearm Germany. Pretty much every move he makes from this point on is about ticking one of those boxes. So how did he start? Well, he started cautiously. From about 1933 to 1936, Hitler was basically just testing the waters, seeing just how far he could push the other European powers before they'd actually push back. And this is a perfect example of his first major challenge. In 1935, he just flat out announced that Germany was rearming. The army was supposed to be capped at 100,000 soldiers. He was aiming for 500,000. They weren't allowed to have an air force at all. Well, he just created one, the Luftwaffe. This was a massive public violation of the treaty. And he wasn't just talking about it, he was building things. So what was the response? A united front to stop him? Nope. Instead, he got the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Britain basically made a side deal with him, letting him build a navy. This sent a huge signal to Hitler. The Allies were not on the same page. Then came his biggest gamble yet. He marched German troops back into the Rhineland, which was supposed to be a demilitarized buffer zone with France. I mean, his own generals were nervous. The German army was still pretty weak. But Hitler guessed right. The Allies protested, sure, but they did nothing. And Hitler learned a hugely valuable lesson. He could break the rules, and no one would actually do anything to stop him. Now, that lack of a real response, that wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate policy that the Allies had embraced, and we know it today as appeasement. So what is appeasement? Put simply, it was the policy of giving Hitler what he said he wanted to avoid another war. You have to put yourself in their shoes. People in Britain and France were still haunted by the horrors of World War I. They were struggling through the Great Depression, and honestly, some leaders thought a stronger Germany could be a good wall against Stalin's Soviet Union. So giving in seemed like a small price to pay for peace. And the absolute high point of appeasement came in 1938. Hitler started demanding the Sudetenland, a part of Czechoslovakia with a lot of German speakers. So at the Munich conference, Britain and France just agreed. They handed over a piece of another country to Hitler, and they didn't even invite the Czech government to the meeting. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, flew back home, waved a piece of paper in the air, and famously declared that he had achieved peace in our time. It was a moment of incredible relief for millions, but it would go down as one of history's most tragic misjudgments. Because that peace lasted for less than 6 months. This is the moment, the real turning point, where all of Hitler's promises were exposed as lies and his true ambition, outright conquest, was laid bare for everyone to see. In March of 1939, Hitler completely shattered the Munich Agreement. His troops marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia. Now, this had nothing to do with uniting German speakers. This was just swallowing up a free country. The mask was completely off. For Britain and France,
That was it. The final straw. The policy of appeasement was dead. They finally realized that Hitler could not be trusted, and he couldn't be reasoned with. He had to be stopped by force. And they made a promise. They would defend the next country in his sights, Poland.
So now Hitler knows that war is probably on the horizon, and he makes one last, absolutely stunning move on the diplomatic chessboard to make sure he can attack Poland on his terms. And this was it, the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. I mean, you have to understand how shocking this was. Two bitter ideological enemies, fascism and communism, suddenly shaking hands and promising peace. The world was stunned. But of course, there was a secret part to the deal. They agreed to carve up Poland right between them. For Hitler, it was brilliant. He could invade Poland without having to worry about fighting a two-front war. But he still needed an excuse for his own people. So, on August 31st, he just created one. In a classic false flag operation, Nazi SS troops dressed up as Polish soldiers and staged a fake attack on a German radio station. They even left a dead body there to sell the story. And just like that, Hitler had his pretext, Polish aggression. So, with his deal with Stalin secure and his fake justification in place, the path was clear. The final domino was just about to fall. And just look how fast everything happened. The pact is signed on August 23rd. Just over a week later, Germany invades Poland. Britain and France give Hitler an ultimatum: pull your troops out, or we are at war. He ignores it, and 2 days later, they kept their promise. And with those somber words from Neville Chamberlain, the very same man who had promised peace in our time, the Second World War began in Europe. The long, dangerous game of gambling and appeasement had finally reached its disastrous conclusion. It all leaves us with a huge, lingering question. When you're facing an aggressive power, where exactly is the line between smart, pragmatic diplomacy and dangerous weakness? That's the core dilemma that the 1930s forces us to confront, and it's a question that remains just as important today.